Dude, you know what?
You said that
Tom
really
Brady's
quiet.
not a cheater, all right? He's a total. It's amazing.
Oh,
You got a
yeah.
boy crush on him.
Let's
That's
talk about
right.
this. No, we're going to
So right when
Well,
you
this is
publish your book-
podcast extra number 206, and apparently we're already starting out with some controversy, or
So-
like we like to call it Andy Gate.
That's right. Once Andy published Thinking, Tom Brady was found out to be a cheater.
You know what? Never.
Whoa.
Don't say my book title like
Whoa.
that. How dare you?
You added the
It's a
question mark.
Yeah, but I didn't add that.
He didn't add your voice cracking.
Yeah. I didn't add your
It's like a bad
16-year-old.
Brady Bunch episode.
Yeah.
He's targeting a younger demographic with his writing. I'm just trying to be the voice of the people.
Okay, but
now
seriously,
you're going to
you're going to
puberty.
defend Tom Brady and the cheaters? That's a new band.
Okay, first of all, it's Tom Brady, and second of all, he's not a cheater.
Oh, the whole team
So
is,
when
though,
you
because they've been caught
when you
before.
fiddle with the equipment for the game to give yourself a competitive advantage, that accounts for what? What is that?
Well, I'm not 100% sure.
No, I'm just
You know-
not a hard question to answer.
Well, all I'm saying is balls have air inside them,
No,
and
they do.
sometimes a little bit of air leaks out.
No, they do.
Now,
they
it's
totally
the
do.
intention is
Especially
like
9
these.
out of or 11 out of 12 of them. They
And
all do.
especially if you take a little needle, like right before the game.
in a bathroom, and you call yourself the deflator. Hey, but I'm just trying to lose weight. That's why.
And you're in official position on the team.
Yeah.
Paid
Something
position.
I think the Super Bowl should go back to Seattle or just
Whatever.
replay the game.
Whatever.
Replay. We'd win. In a second game, we would win.
Of course we would.
Because we'd have healthy players.
Yes, we would.
And
but you know
Russell
what?
would know not to throw that pass.
We lost fair and square.
And the,
Did we?
The deflate
Yeah.
scandal was for the AFC Championship,
Yeah,
not
and
the
the
Super Bowl.
it didn't really matter. It's just that the Patriots have a history of cheating and everything, or what is it? What do they say? Bending the rules. Everybody wants to compare it to baseball. I gotta be honest. You don't want to compare anything to baseball.
No, not at all.
Like baseball is known for all of its stupid cheating, and this is what I actually heard people during the steroid scandal saying stuff like, "Well, I mean, baseball's always had people trying to gain competitive advantages, but then somehow we lifted steroids up above greasing the ball and stealing signs and all that stuff." Which I'm still trying to figure out why you can do this. Why you can
Grease the ball?
why you can raise. What's the difference? You're gaining a
the size of Barry
competitive
Bonds'
advantage in both ways. And the only difference is that one works better than the other. Like steroids apparently works really well to try to help people hit the ball well. Right?
So
it's
Greg
worse.
would take steroids.
It's worse. So if
That might actually be a good idea.
Did that change the voice?
no, I'm just trying to. I want somebody out there who's listening to
Make it
this.
worse.
I would like them to give me a cogent argument for why steroids is different than Deflategate. Why is it? Why is the use of steroids to enhance one's performance different than the Deflategate
But
thing?
they're trying to ban Deflategate, or deflating the balls, and they're trying to ban steroids too.
Absolutely, but people are freaking out about. They say I've heard several sports talk show hosts just say, "Oh, it's not the same. It's not the same," but then they never give a reason for why it's not the same. And I'm trying to figure out, well, why isn't it the same?
If you deflate the ball, it affects both teams, right?
No,
You do
No,
steroids.
No,
Yeah.
no.
Not
Because
only
they
affects
bring
your
in
team.
different balls.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
The
it's
balls
weird.
that you get to play with, so it provides a competitive advantage for your team.
It's a matter of where the needle goes. Does it go in your arm or the ball?
Right,
Totally.
There are needles
go.
involved either way.
Right.
That's my point.
So the same
That's
thing.
my point here. Yeah, that's
So-
really.
And my just cracked.
So should a Christian cheer
room.
for a team that deliberately cheats?
Should-
Andy, how do you feel
Here's
about
my.
that?
Can I have a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Does Andy's book need a second round of printing so that he can make a correction and not worship Tom Brady?
Oh, that's true. You mentioned him in there.
It's true that he has 3 Super Bowl rings,
and now he's got 4.
and now
Because
he's
you're
got 4,
With an
prophetic.
and
asterisk.
which he did not cheat to get the 4th one.
You're prophetic because this will be taken away from him.
Has he admitted to cheating?
He actually did cheat to get the 4th one. That's the whole point.
See, I don't think he's admitted to cheating, and they are in
Well,
fact
Does
fighting.
a cheater ever admit to cheating? Like,
I didn't
really?
admit it, so I didn't do it.
That's right.
Hey,
Silence.
I want to hear a confession before. Who is that?
Yeah,
Lance
'cause
Armstrong. I want to hear a Lance Armstrong on Oprah.
Because that's how our system works.
Yeah, that's how it works.
You're
He's got to
innocent
get on
until you've
Oprah.
told everyone that
your
you're
story
guilty.
on Oprah, right? And I'm
Until
not
you
going to
told
believe it until
Oprah.
that happens.
Okay, so what if we just have like the normal baseball league, and then we have a league where you're allowed
Yes.
to do whatever you want?
Totally.
Football, baseball, basketball, like that'd be awesome.
Do you know what one people would watch?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
The one on roids.
Oh, totally. It'd be all sorts of things happening.
Oh, baseball's not doing so hot in the popularity these days.
In attendance wise,
I think it's
that's
actually
because Toronto's in last place in their division.
Yeah, Toronto really is the bellwether of the entire league. They are.
What's a bellwether?
Toronto.
What is the actual bellwether? Isn't it a thing?
Well, it's a hotel as well. It's a nice place, actually. If you ever want to stay in a nice place in Bellingham, Bellwether.
You didn't answer my question.
I did. What's the Bellwether? I told you. It's a hotel
isn't
down in Bellingham.
Bellwether some sort of
it's
nautical term?
Yes, I think so. Figure of speech, Darcy.
So you just use words you don't know what they actually mean. Okay.
Yeah.
Bonus points for
At
saying
least I didn't
nautical.
make it up.
I know. That's pretty good. I had to think about that one for a while. All right. Well, we are in a different room today, and I don't know if you can notice the difference or not, but it's getting really warm in here.
And I'm a little bit worried about the oxygen, the quantity of oxygen.
There's a little hole in the door. So that's where we get our oxygen.
There are 6 of us in a very small room.
But it's warming up. This is Darcy, and this is episode number 206. With me is Andy.
It's good to be here.
And Jeff.
Hi.
And Greg.
Hi.
And Kyle.
Hello.
And Jeremy.
Hello.
And Ezra could not make it today. I don't know why, but he's
Well,
not
he said
here.
he's got a stomach problem.
Oh, whatever.
Sure, right after a long weekend.
Give him what you had over the weekend?
That's what he said. He sent me a text message saying that I apparently gave. I didn't see him all weekend, but apparently I gave him the illness.
Did
How?
you have tummy troubles?
I did during my sermon.
Really? Which one?
The
Which
Sunday
tummy?
morning ones, both of them.
Did you have to run out at any time?
Well, let's just say that I barely made it to the 11:15 one.
Really?
Yeah, really. Didn't.
Wow,
yeah.
sorry to hear that.
Yeah,
I was good thing. I went Saturday night.
yeah. That
Normally
was.
I
I
go
was feeling
Sunday
okay.
morning.
On the
Wow.
way home, while I was driving home, yeah, it didn't feel so good.
Wow. So what happens if all of a sudden you just couldn't preach on
God
Sunday?
bless video.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So people would get it.
I think
so,
one time in my time at Northview, we had to run a video on Sunday morning because I went home and same kind of thing happened, although it was much worse.
So how bad do you guys have to feel before you wouldn't actually go up on stage? Because I know you've preached sick sometimes too, right, Greg?
Yeah, it's
Yep.
it's the stomach problems are the things that would stop me. It's when you can't actually stand there and head colds and even throats, and so you can usually get around those with help, and because we have amplification and stuff,
Yeah.
you can get around all that. But it's the stomach stuff when you're actually physically so ill that you need to be laying down.
So is there ever any thought that this is some sort of spiritual attack
Sure.
on you? And how do you work that out in your head then?
Well, I have a big enough view of these things. I think I think that Satan can use sickness and these sorts of things to trouble me. But yeah, I pray about it and ask people to pray for me about it. And sometimes it goes away, and other times it doesn't.
I feel like every sermon is a spiritual attack.
Yeah, you have to
Yeah.
go through a process of almost, it's almost a childbirth thing going on there, where there's
Yeah.
a lot of pain, emotional, pain before you give a sermon.
I tell you, it's like if you ever want to experience spiritual warfare,
Preach.
preach, share the truth.
Yeah.
This ties in with a question that came in for the podcast here. And if you have questions, send them to extra@northview.org. But it's about the story of Job and what it entails. It paints God as a jealous and prideful God, and that he's easily duped by Satan into allowing him to wreak havoc on a blameless and upright follower. Why would he allow this?
So, go ahead, Greg. Go ahead.
That'd be Kyle.
I don't think God is duped, because God is the one who presents Job. Satan's roaming to and fro on the earth and has a conversation with God, and God is the one that brings Job into the discussion. He's the one that says, "Haven't you noticed my servant Job, and look how righteous he is?" And then Satan says, "Oh, the only reason he's righteous is because of how you've blessed him." And then God says, "Okay, it's on. We'll see whether Job loves me for the stuff I've given him, or he loves me for me." And so Satan is given reign to take things away from him, his wealth, his family, even his health in the midst of that. And at the end, Job holds on to God, and he recognized that his view of God isn't as big as it needs to be.
There's another question here. It says, how is it that Satan can approach God in Job?
That's one of the interesting parts about that story is the way that it portrays the heavenly court as if Satan kind of walks to and fro before God. You know, in most of the Old Testament, Satan is seen as a prosecuting attorney more than anything else. So, yeah, I mean, it's something
Even
you have
Satan's
to...
name.
Yeah, Satan. I mean, that's
Accuser.
the Greek, right?
Accuser.
Accuser. But that's what he really does portray himself as the one who stands before the judge and accuses all these people who God has justified and saying they deserve judgment and these sorts of things. But yeah, it should be part of, I think, the way that we understand the heavenly court, and probably change our understanding to it to fit this sort of thing. Right. I do think that Kyle's right, though, that the idea that somehow God is being duped or he's capricious because of these actions. I understand that language a little bit more than the dupe thing, that he sounds capricious. But only if you think that God's prime directive is the comfort of his people in the present moment. See, as a parent, I know full well that there are things that I permit my kids to endure because I know it will turn them into the kind of people they need to be. So I think that God... So would you call me unloving for doing that? In fact, I would say you're unloving in not doing it.
Right.
Before we accuse God of being capricious and mean-spirited about these sorts of things, we should understand that I think his goals are different than ours.
Do some people think, I'm not saying I hold this view, but some people argue that
a friend of yours does?
Right, that Job is a story. What in the text would make you think that it's not just a story that's supposed to teach us some sort of principle?
Well, I mean, I think the first couple chapters are presented in a historical narrative, and just the genre itself. I mean, the rest of it is poetry, and so I'm willing to go a little bit with that direction because of the nature of the genre, that it is poetry after the first couple chapters, but it is presented kind of historically at the beginning. My question, actually, I would want to flip it on its head. Why would you assume it's not? And not history.
Not history.
And I think that you would have to start with a kind of skepticism in order to arrive at that conclusion. So if it's being presented sort of historically, even though there is poetry, I mean, most of the book itself is written poetic, Hebrew poetic language, you would have to start with a skepticism toward the Bible, toward the book of Job itself, in order to arrive at a conclusion that this isn't real. And I don't know why you would do that. And maybe it's because you don't like the way God is portrayed. Maybe you don't like the idea that God doesn't send whirlwinds. There's a whole bunch of presuppositions that I think that would go into that. I have conversations with people from time to time about this, where they'll bring up certain passages of Scripture or whatever, and they'll say, well, that's not historical. And I always want to ask them, what would lead you, like what is to be gained by you saying that? What's driving that argument? Because on the face of it, it sounds historical.
Right.
And almost always, well, it is always, there's some sort of agenda that someone has. Well, we can't believe in a God who does miracles. Well, we can't believe, in light of modern science, we can't believe in this or that. Well, because the world is a closed system, we can't believe. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so it tends to be a worldview discussion.
Kyle, can you read Job 1:6?
Job 1:6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them.
Okay, there's a question here which says comes out of that verse, but I didn't hear it there. But how is it that God doesn't know where he came from?
Well, verse
Doesn't know where
7.
Satan came
Verse
from.
7, the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?"
There you
And
go.
Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it." And then the Lord said, "Well, have you considered my servant Job?"
So when God asks Adam in the garden, "Why are you high? Where are you?" Is he asking that question because he doesn't know the answer?
I've lost my keys. I don't know where I put them. I've lost Adam. I don't know where he is.
I think sometimes there are lots of places where God will ask a question and he has other reasons for asking it, other than saying that he actually is gaining some sort of knowledge in that. It might just be It might just be a way of writing that drives the conversation forward, right?
Yeah, when my kids are doing
What's going
something
on?
that they shouldn't be
We say-
doing, and I've seen them do something that they shouldn't be doing,
What do you do?
I
What
will
are you
often
doing?
ask them, "What are you doing?" when I've just seen you do something I asked you not
You
to
want
do,
them to
and-
admit it.
Yeah, I want
not
them to
su-
reflect on it and say,
I'm not
think about
necessarily
what that looks
suggesting
like.
that that's completely what's happening here. I'm just saying that be careful with locution. Be careful with the intent here, and just assuming that God is gaining knowledge in this. And the same thing that I think that there are lots of passages in the Old Testament, for example, that seem to indicate that God's gaining some sort of knowledge, and we would want to, he says to Abram after he sacrificed Isaac, or willing to sacrifice Isaac on the top of the mountain. Now I know. And okay, so what does that mean? Did God gain some sort of knowledge there? Now I know. So you can play around with these issues, and they're big issues to play around with. But there are understandings of it that do make sense of God's knowledge.
Jeff, don't you think there's also something to be said about the fact that the Bible isn't a dictation? That this is God, working through human authors.
Well, he uses the language. Authors use language the way we use language. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Is when we say stuff like that, like Kyle is bringing up a way that he normally uses language. What are you doing to his kids? And I think it's that very well could be the case here with Satan. By the way, we would suggest, or we would say that the greatest gift the greatest thing in the universe is God. Is it not? So. The expression of God's character is the greatest gift in the universe, right? So if that's the greatest thing in the universe for anyone even to experience, then it would seem to me that that's what God's doing in all these passages. And so if the reason God can be arrogant and prideful or whatever is because by the expression of his own glory and greatness, that's the best thing for all the creatures in the world. That's different than Darcy being arrogant and prideful, because Darcy he's not the greatest thing in the universe. For him to point to himself and to say, check me out, is a letdown. Sorry, brother. But for God to point to himself, isn't that actually doing everyone a favor?
Yeah.
So I think sometimes we assume, though, about God that wow, he sounds mean and so up himself. And so, yeah, he sounds up himself because he should be. That's a good thing. Sorry, that's a phrase you guys don't use here. It's down under they use that, like being someone who's really pompous or really full of themselves. And I'm saying that for God to be full of himself and to express his fullness of himself to everyone else is a good thing. Whereas for Andy, it's not.
How's that not prideful though? Like
It
for Andy,
is,
it'd be prideful,
but it is
which is wrong.
right. But why is it wrong for Andy to be prideful?
You can't back it up.
That's right. God can. And it's not the best thing for his friends and neighbors for him to point to himself, because everyone's going to be like, yeah, thanks, Andy, but I don't think so. But God is.
Yeah.
I think one of the other things, too, that's important to note is that God's a person, that he has a personality, and that you don't get this robotic, dialogue taking place between God and people. That I think is important. That God is somebody that we can actually relate to. It's not like I'm trying to relate to some sort of robot that's like spitting out. Input comes in and there's just output and everything. It's very cut and dry. And if that made sense.
It did make sense.
Good. Glad that made sense.
At the end of Job, it says that the Lord made him prosperous again. And this listener is saying, as if this makes up for allowing Satan to murder his whole family. I'm not sure what to make of this. So how do we make sense of that? I mean, God gives him kind of everything back and more. But yet, I'm not sure. If I was Job, I'd go, well, yeah, that makes up for it.
Yeah, I think you need to take the long view. And by that, I mean, you need to understand that, most of the book of Job, from my point of view, can be made sense of according to what I just said, which is that God's goal in the universe is not the comfort of the immediate comfort of his people. It's actually for their long-term comfort. And I think that what God is trying to do in the book of Job is a greater thing than Job. He's actually trying to express his freedom God's freedom. He's also trying to express that it is possible for people to love God even though they suffer. And at the end of the book, it is trying to say something profound about who God is and what his wisdom is compared to the wisdom of men. What I find interesting about that question, and I'm not trying to be, if I had the person in the room, I would say this as well, that it is interesting that a book that is trying to point to the grandeur of God and the limitedness of people is now being used as an accusation against God and the wisdom of us. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, it's the flip of it. The book is saying that God's wise and we're not wise. Where were you when I made the foundations of the earth? And where were you when you did these sorts of things? And now we've taken the book and said, well, that was really mean of God to do. How dare you, Lord? Well, that's the whole point of the book, is to put you and I in our place and to say, actually, that God knows more than we do. He sees the end from the beginning. He understands why it is that he does what he does. And you need to stay in your lane when it is that you think about these things toward him. And so the fact that he prospers him in the end, I think, is fantastic. Is the Lord trying to make up for what he did? I don't know. I don't think so. I think that it's a wonderful ending to the story in that regard.
I think one of the things, too, that often comes to my mind is that God doesn't seem to have a problem with all of us dying. And I think that sometimes we lose that perspective. That it gets back to what Jeff was saying. We have a very limited focus. We tend to look at this earth and our short life, and that this is everything we put our hope in. And the Apostle Paul makes it clear that his hope is set on the life to come, that his hope is set on heaven. And so I think that, because even if when you take a look at Jesus, right? I mean, Jesus heals people. And he could have healed everyone, but he doesn't. And he only heals a few people. He
goes away
feeds a few people.
Into the hills at some point when there's all these people waiting to be healed, and he doesn't do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, the big perspective, I think, is really, really helpful. Imagine we're on the new earth, and we've been there for 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, as the hymn goes. And then we meet somebody who we hadn't met before and talking with them, and they're like, oh, yeah, I'm in the Bible. Really? You're in the Bible? Yeah, I'm one of Job's first kids. Oh, so you had, your part to play on the earth when it was fallen, and, you did good things, you did bad things, but you saw the faith of your dad and worshipped the God of your dad, and it ended as you didn't expect it, as it does for probably a vast majority of people. But this age that we're in now will never end, and that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. The final question on this, that I guess the listener kind of boiled it down to, is how can we tell when Satan is working in our lives?
Silence.
One thing that I'm always cautious when people talk like that, because I think that we're so quick to give God's qualities and characteristics to Satan as though Satan is omnipresent.
Yeah.
And I'd want to just caution somebody immediately from talking like that. I often find that a lot of Christians aren't really sure when they talk about Satan, sometimes even too, what they mean. Like, I often hear, not to go down a rabbit trail, but I'll often hear Christians talk about Satan too as that Satan is evil, instead of Satan does evil. It's not like there are these dueling forces out there. There's good and evil, and we're sure hoping good's going to win. There's good, and God is good. And there's a corruption of his goodness, and Satan in a third of heaven's army, the angels fell with him. And so yeah, there's a spiritual war that takes place. But to give God's characteristics to Satan is... I think for some reasons has kind of crept into Christianity, and I hear that.
Agreed. I don't. My answer to this question, as I've been asked this before, is I don't know if it matters. Is that awful of me to say? I think that when you say it, how do I know Satan's working in my life? I think that if you understand that God is the sovereign King of the universe, and you recognize that the Lord, even in permitting Satan to do this, had it done for his own purposes. Right. I just think at the end of the day, we're called to pray to God, our Father. There's not a lot of evidence to say that we're supposed to cast out demons of of provinces, or I mean, people cobble together some sort of theology and then make their prayer life significantly around those sorts of things. I just don't see that in the Bible. What I see is the people of God addressing God, their sovereign King, about the things they're concerned about. And I think that what you can say is, okay, well, Satan or my flesh or the world system, which all work in concert, are might be pushing me to do this. I might want to do that thing, and these awful things are either happening to me or I've done them. I just think that you need to understand, though, that within God's wider providence, that He's got you. And so this is funny because we just brought up our preaching and stuff. I actually think that the Lord uses the chastisement from Satan and spiritual forces to bring about better preaching. And I think without it, I don't think our preaching is quite as laborious and therefore not quite as deep and careful.
Because you could bring up the whole Job thing. Like, why does God allow, Jeff or whoever's preaching on Sunday morning to be afflicted? Because I feel it every time I speak.
Right.
But I could totally see what you're saying.
But God's got a goal there. That's
Exactly.
my point. Is God's got a goal, and His agents, the agency, might be evil forces, might be your flesh, might be the devil, whatever. The agency might be evil, but God intends it for good, and so I'm going to give Him praise for what He redeems out of it. And I certainly, of course, if if somebody comes up to you and you're concerned that they're demon possessed, certainly cast that sucker out. Right. But I think that the normal kind of life that we live is God in His providence using everything for the good of His people.
Well, and the way you defend yourself from the attacks when they come is you take every thought captive, right? It's the battle against Satan and his army is in the realm of of beliefs and of how we think about things to be true. So when you
stand firm,
even when you feel like you are being attacked, you can remember that what's not happening is not the big cosmic arm wrestling match where God and Satan are going at it, and you just got to see who's going to win this one, right? No, it's already been won. God wins. He's stronger. So you
Satan
engage
is his
in the
patsy,
work,
right? He's his dupe.
He's allowed.
And that's the way the Bible presents it. And so I don't think you should focus too much on the dupe and how he has this some kind of freedom outside of. I mean, he's on a leash.
Well, and this is one of the beautiful parts of what happened on the cross, right? Is Christ has freed us from Satan's authority, and now we, through Christ and His sacrifice, actually have a victory over Satan. We're not bound. We're not chained to him. He doesn't own us anymore. God owns us. Yeah. And so with that that doesn't mean we're not going to have the attacks. It just means that we can actually look at Satan and say, you don't own me.
Right. And the point that I really want to emphasize, though, in the actual practical living is what Luther used to say. He's still God's devil. Mm-hmm. So we talk to God, our Father, about these things. We address Him. And if you have concerns about the way your life is going, talk to your Lord. Right. About it, who might be allowing this season for whatever purpose, but it's good, and you can be promised, right, that He will work all things together for good of those who love Him and called according to His purpose.
So Jeff, when you were having intestinal difficulties over the weekend, were you thinking that's an attack, or I just had too much special sauce on my Big Mac?
Maybe. That was my point. It was like, to me, when these things happen, I'm like, well, look, there's only one I don't feel the need to diagnose it. Mm-hmm. As I'm very willing to say, yes, it's natural, it's spiritual, it's all those things. I have a big enough worldview to incorporate those things. The question then is, what am I going to do about it? And the answer is, I'm going to pray to my God who loves me. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm saying. I just don't want somebody get caught up in this, like I'm trying to divine or figure out whether or not this is Satan or this is the Lord. The answer is, it's the Lord, ultimately, who is using the agency of others, or allowing it. I'm happy to go with that kind of language, allowing the agency of others. And the act itself might be evil and horrible, and the Lord cringes and is grieved by that. He's also permitted it for a greater purpose. And in the end, you and I and all of us will see what that purpose was.
Don't you think that's the problem, though? I guess that some people want a pendulum swing one way hard or the other. So the pendulum swing all the way that everything is being caused by Satan and his demons. And then the other way, this Christian secularism, if you will, where Satan and demons aren't involved in anything. And
But they are.
And we never talk about them at all.
Yeah.
And then there's this balancing act that there's this middle ground.
John Piper has written a book on Job, and it's a poem basically, and there's a video, and it's really insightful of just looking at Job's struggles and wrestling with who God is in the midst of all these things. So I recommend that to anyone who would want to investigate it.
Cool. Well, thank you for that question or questions. Here's another one sent from somebody at the Mission Campus of Northview. I would like to hear what we have to say about the Sabbath day.
Sorry, I keep kicking this thing under the table.
We're in their new table. We have a table that's new, so if you hear occasional rattle, it's because Greg's shifting in his seat.
And if you just heard that big crash a moment ago in our soundproof room,
We're not sure what that was.
Should we
But clearly it's not soundproof.
Sorry, Mission. Keep
yeah,
going.
Campus,
somebody
yes.
from the Mission Campus sent in a question. Just a question about the Sabbath day. What is Sabbath day, and why do we meet to worship on Sunday? Now, of course, at Abbotsford campus, it's Saturday and Sunday we meet, but what is Sabbath day, and why do we worship on Sunday?
Why don't we worship on Saturday?
It was under the law, the Sabbath was Saturday, right? So if you're a Seventh-day
Jewish law.
Adventist, you do worship the Lord on Saturday, and they actually believe in the enduring significance of the Mosaic law at this point. As a Christian, I believe that we've been freed from that law by the finished work of Christ, who fulfilled it on our behalf, and we worship on Sundays because it's when the Lord was resurrected from the dead. And so people often make a big deal about Easter. Oh, we celebrate Resurrection Sunday. Every week is Resurrection Sunday, from my point of view. And so it's a historical move from the old covenant to the new, is my answer to the
So we've
question.
thrown around here in the past, like, well, maybe we should try a Thursday night service or a Friday night service.
Yep.
We do a Saturday night service.
If we were in a Muslim context, I'm quite sure we would do a Friday service.
Yeah, that's the holy day in Islam. So a lot of people who work in those contexts, they'll gather for their church services on Friday because that's the holy day in that context.
Good. Here's a question. What do you make of Molenism?
I make cookies out of it.
Why don't I explain?
Andy, what do you
No,
make of
Andy, do you
Molinism?
make banana bread? Or do you prefer...
Oh, you had banana
My wife
bread.
actually
provide
makes
Molinist
amazing
muffins.
banana bread.
I would like if your wife would give me a piece of
Can
that
your
one
wife
day.
make Molinist muffins for
chocolate
us?
chip banana bread?
Ooh.
He had this morning eating in our meeting.
It was
He
delicious.
didn't share any.
Well, let me just, for those people who are interested, let me just explain what Molinism is, and then I just want to explain why it's helpful.
I'm going to forever link it to banana bread with chocolate chips.
And that might be helpful. Molinism comes from a 16th century Jesuit by the name of Molina, and the idea is just a way of trying to understand God's sovereignty, of how God knows everything, knows what I'm going to do, and He knows the choices I'm going to make. But yet at the same time, I'm free, and that I have this libertarian freedom, that I'm able to do stuff. So if God knows everything I'm going to do, then the question is, well, can I do otherwise? And then that question raises a bigger question, and that is, well, then am I really free? And so Molinism is just basically this idea of how can we hold those two things, that I'm free and yet God's sovereign, and try to understand those two things. And one of the things that I find, particularly when people are dealing with philosophy, is they don't understand that not everything in philosophy is trying to give you an answer. Sometimes in philosophy, it's just trying to give you a possible answer to demonstrate that you don't have a logical contradiction. Mm-hmm. And so this is where I think Molinism can be helpful, in that it's simply an idea, and particularly the idea is is that, Molenism speaking, is this idea that God knows counterfactuals. He knows what you would do in any particular situation. And so maybe it's the case that God has so ordained the universe that he has placed you in the exact circumstances that's required for you to come to saving faith. And that that there's other people who don't come to saving faith, and that's because there is no scenario in which they would come to saving faith. Now, is that the answer? And anyone that holds the Molenism, I think they would just say, well, it's a possible answer. That they're not trying to give an answer that they necessarily think is the case. They're just demonstrating that you don't have a logical contradiction because there's a possible answer. And so ultimately,
the logical contradiction that he's speaking of is between divine sovereignty and human freedom. So Molenism is a way to try as an attempt to solve that dilemma. God knows every possible decision you could make at every possible time. And the world that he has created, he created to save the most possible people. Those he elected based upon his knowledge, foreknowledge, as seen as foresight, but exhaustive foresight. They're not just simple foreknowledge. We call it just, like he knows just little things he knows every decision, the results of every decision you could ever make and every person in the world could ever make. And the world that he has created is a world where the most possible people can come to faith in Christ. That's traditional Molenism or middle knowledge.
Well, and that's where it becomes, so like one of the outworkings then is this potential to like a compromise between Arminianism and Calvinism, so that you can still use this election terminology.
Right. You should know that there are Calvinists who would say Molinism is actually true, that God does know counterfactuals, and there are Arminians who argue that Molinism is true. But most Molinists are Arminian because they're basing their viewpoint on God's election. They're saying, why does God elect? He elects based upon what he foresees in people.
But again, I just want to stress this idea that this is a possibility. So let me just throw a different one by some people that I think will confuse people, and you can take.
That's good.
I know, right? I think I just confused myself. You have Alvin Plantinga, for example, who is a Calvinist, but yet he holds to the free will defense. And so you might be thinking, what? He's a Calvinist, but he holds to the free will defense? Well, yeah, he holds to it, not because he necessarily thinks it's the case, but again, that it's a possible answer demonstrating that you don't have a logical
philosophy at
contradiction.
times, some places is like a game.
Mm-hmm.
And the game is trying to avoid certain gutters, like bowling, right? And one of the gutters on the side is the law of non-contradiction, that something can't be A and not A at the same time. And so philosophers are playing this game, and they're presenting possibilities that something could be logically consistent without, so it doesn't go into the gutter of law of non-contradiction, and therefore you can prove that, hey, the argument against, for example, Christianity, if God is all powerful and all loving, and there's evil in the world, then there's no God. That's been the argument for atheists for a long time. Well, Plantinga's like, well, no, there's a way that this could work, and he argues for the free will defense, even though he doesn't totally. It's not. If you asked him, what do you believe the Bible teaches or whatever, he's not probably going to answer that way. But he's trying to say this keeps us out of the gutter though.
So, what scripture passages would you appeal to show that God knows counterfactuals?
The easiest one is in Matthew 25:11. Oh, sorry, jeez, that's awful. Matthew 11, 20. I want to say 23. I'm coming up with it now. Here we go. Yeah, Matthew 11:20. Then Jesus began to denounce the cities where most of his mighty works had been done because they did not repent. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for Tyre and Sidon than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted in heaven? You will be brought down to Hades. For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. And so here you have Jesus saying that there is a possible world where these miracles were done in those other places. And what would have happened had they been done there is that they would have repented. Now, an Arminian Molinist is going to come to this, and they're going to say, see, this is evidence that God chose the world that he created is a world where Tyre and Sidon don't repent. Okay? Because the most possible people are saved in a world where they don't repent, but others do. That's, from my point of view, that's not what Jesus is essentially saying here. I actually think that this goes on and follows to the next passage where Jesus hides and reveals things. The Molenist Arminian is going to say, well, he hides and reveals based upon his knowledge of these counterfactuals. So this is the debate, and like I said, there are Calvinists who are happy with Terence Thiessen being one of them, who argues for a kind of what's it called a Calvinist Molenism, where which is an interesting viewpoint as well. So this is philosophical debate, and people meander in and out about it. It's actually well worth thinking about. If you're interested in this, you can go that way, and it's a very fascinating discussion. It can solve some problems for you. At other points, it also leaves some problems because you're left with a God. You're left with the fact then that the world that you inhabit, where so many people aren't coming to faith in Jesus, is the best possible world. Where the Jews get slaughtered. This is the best world that God could have made.
Are there any resources that you could recommend for readers if they want to look into it more?
Yeah, definitely. William Lane Craig is probably the biggest champion of Molinism. Yeah. But one of the things that I've found, you can read others on it. What's his book called? Do you guys know his book on Molinism? I can't remember. Well, he has a book on divine foreknowledge.
There it is. A book by William Lane Craig on divine foreknowledge would probably do it.
But one of the things that I've noticed is I've heard others share their take on Molinism, like Gary DeWeese and others, is that it seems to me that each theologian or philosopher has a slightly different understanding.
It's philosophical, right? They're trying to tweak and change, and
so don't think that there's like one form. I've seen it presented in different forms.
Right. And there are people, for example, who believe, so a Calvinist Molinist would actually argue, got elected, not based upon what he foresaw in people's response, but he elected. And then he also knows counterfactuals, and so he can preserve a certain amount of libertarian freedom in his people. It's just that when it comes to who comes to faith in Jesus, he is determined ahead of time who that's going to be and how he will bring it about through their free choices. So there are ways to play. That's why Andy's right when he says there's like a wide range. Like Molinism doesn't necessarily pin you down to one. So William Lane Craig's kind of Molinism isn't the only kind. So this is the way it is in philosophy. Everybody tweaks everybody's little.
Would Molina be happy with the way his name is used?
That's a very good question.
So the bottom line question on that one is this a good biblical view to hold?
Well, it depends. I think it depends on how you hold it. Honestly, I think the approach that you need to take when it comes to this issue is you need to settle in your mind what the scriptures teach first. And then so that you can come to the conclusion, right, whatever philosophical attempts I make to try to merge these two ideas together, divine sovereignty and human freedom, that it has to make sense of the passages of Scripture that speak to it.
And I want to get back and highlight it again. That
your book?
Yes. Thinking.
It's on sale.
Yeah, answering last week's question. I want to highlight again this idea that a lot of that question that's being brought, is this a biblical view to hold? People need to understand that these views, these philosophical views, aren't necessarily views that people necessarily believe. They're possible answers to that can be held to demonstrate that you don't have a logical contradiction.
Is it fair, though, to say, I don't know the history of Molinism that well, but from what I gather and the interactions I've had with it, which have been somewhat extensive, I think it's a view that was developed philosophically, not necessarily biblically. It's a philosophical view that finds some support in the Bible, in the passage I just said, that God knows counterfactual, so here's how this might work out. It's not a view where somebody came along and said, okay, what does Romans 9 teach about this? What does Romans 8 teach about that? What does Ephesians 1 teach about this? What does 1 Peter 1 teach? That's not, how's the word election used in the Scriptures? What does foreknowledge mean in the Bible? These are more theological, biblical questions, and I don't think Molinism started there. It has some answers, I think, or attempts at answers to those questions that might be helpful or might not. But you need to understand. That's what. But I'm going to say that I take the Word of God to be the primary authority, and so I think you need to settle what the Scriptures say about it first.
Agreed. Plus, though, I would add this, and I would agree with what Jeff just said. Each year we go to the Evangelical Philosophical and the Evangelical Theological Society. They meet together, and when you go there, so this is the Evangelical theological society. These are orthodox believing men and women. They're all over the map on this issue. So to say whether or not it's biblical, it's a biblical. Like, people wouldn't be kicked out.
What do you mean by that word?
Yeah.
Is what I would say. What do you mean biblical by it? Yeah, I just read you some verses that talk about counterfactuals. So sure, it is. But at every point, it depends on how you're approaching this.
But if the person's asking, is this heresy?
No.
Well, no, it's not heresy.
Okay. You want to talk about plausibility structures?
Oh yeah, Kyle's in it.
Another question on here. Can you expound on this and how it relates to God's sovereign election? So Kyle, what is a plausibility structure?
Can we just talk about plausibility structures and leave the election bit off for just a minute?
Sure.
So this is so helpful, I think, Kyle. What is a plausibility structure?
It's very similar to worldview. It's how you see the world, but it's built into you by your surroundings. So what you think is true is largely driven by the people you hang out with. And it's just a sociological observation that has some, just legitimacy in it. If you think that the Patriots are great even though they cheated, that's probably because you're hanging out with people that think the Patriots are great even though they cheated.
Seriously,
So,
and it's usually the people who you want. It's not always the people you currently hang out with. It's the ones that you want to. It's the community that you want to be a part of. So if you have an affection for a certain community or person or whatever, you want them to think well of you, and so you will believe what they believe, and you will learn what's plausible about reality from them, and what's driving it is more the acceptance within that community than it is necessarily the truth value of the thing. You can see this in the way that the Patriots fans are freaking out and trying to defend Brady, and but again, because they define themselves by this community of Patriot fans, and we cheer for our team, and so it's implausible to us that John Brady could do this. Or what is plausible is the NFL would totally cheat us over because they hate us. Whereas the rest of the people are like, what? You guys look crazy. What? You're stupid and crazy. But as a Seahawks fan, I'm like, oh, this is totally what they do, right? Because we lost. But you see what I mean? So what we believe to be true or false or good or bad oftentimes is driven by the communities in which we live.
C.S. Lewis, in his book Mere Christianity, gives a great example of this. With often we critique those people in the past that would kill witches, for example. But C.S. Lewis brings the case, well, if you thought witches really existed,
do they float?
And were really wreaking havoc right on your village, you would probably kill them too, right? But a lot of this has to do with, and no, they don't float.
Because they're not witches.
But that has everything to do with your plausibility structure.
Right, and you accept most of our plausibility structures are things that we just accept. Most of the things that we believe just because we grew up in the Western world, or we grew up in Canada or the United States or Europe or whatever it is. We believe that there are some things that are just obvious to us. Yeah. And those things can change over time. Right now, we're in a shift right now, I think, having to do with sexual mores. And I think that what's becoming obvious to people is different than what it was obvious to years prior, right?
Yeah. So plausibility structure and worldview, same thing?
Well, they can be used very similarly. I think that I actually prefer the term plausibility structure because I think it's more descriptive of the idea that there are only some things that are plausible within a certain kind of community, and you don't have to form an argument against some things in our culture, right?
Right.
That for example, that people are good. That's just taken as obvious to us. Is it true? Depends on what you mean by good and all these, right? But if you go out and you say stuff like that people are good, everyone's going to cheer for you. And in Western culture, right? Fulfill your dreams. That's it. Okay. I don't need to argue for that. It's just accepted as part of the way that we think about our world. That yes, that I'm an individual and my goal in life is to fulfill my dreams, and I have a dream.
So if you're, I think the question was about election then, or how. So this is really helpful to think about. Election is God using certain means or certain circumstances to show Himself to people. It's not just a lightning bolt necessarily out of the sky. So a lot of the studies with hemorrhaging faith, which was a study of why people are leaving the church or stay in the church as young adults, or Christian Smith's work in the United States about just the way religion works and faith works. One of the findings of both of these studies was how important it is for families to be being faithful and not perfect by any means, but be active in a church community and talking about the faith at home. And so as kids grow up in that kind of context, not just that they're in a church building or with other Christians there, but they're seeing the faith lived out at home. And so that provides a certain plausibility of, hey, this is what my parents believe. This is the way I think the world looks. So that as they grow and they get older and there's lots of questions that come their way, they see how their parents reacted to those types of things or other questions. They see how pastors or friends reacted to those types of things. So that's a context through which they wrestle with, is this really true? And then they come to the conclusion.
The pieces
of
that
yes
I
or no.
want to apply, though, in terms of the election question, though, are a couple. One, the affections that one has are what drive one's plausibility structure. Like if I have an affection for a certain community, that's why somebody will change their views on something, is because they gain a new appreciation or desire to be part of a different group. So I would say that those things oftentimes are outside of our control. The other piece to me that's the most helpful is what plausibility structures show me is how malleable people's opinions are.
Beliefs.
And so I struggle at times when I think that people say, well, God couldn't convince him. No matter what he did, he couldn't convince them. When I look at plausibility structures and worldview thought, I think there's no way. Are you kidding me? People are duped into believing all sorts of things by just the cultural surroundings. So this is one of the critiques I would have of Molenism, is that here's a viewpoint that says that there's no possible world where God could save so-and-so. Come on now. Of course there is. Of course there is. If they grew up in the right settings with the right plausibility structures, of course there is. So that's where I tend to apply it a bit more. I do think it's really helpful. By the way, Peter Berger is the guy who coined this term. He's a sociologist, and he's written extensively on it. So if you like sociology and you want to read Berger, he's not a Christian. Is he Christian?
I'm not sure.
I don't think he is. I think he might have a faith background, but he's not anyway. So he wrote about this extensively. Os Guinness has written a lot about this in Christian circles. I can't think of a specific book right now, but he references plausibility structures quite a lot in his writings, and they're very helpful in thinking through, especially as we start thinking in the modern world about why it is that so many young adults are leaving the church and these sorts of things. That the idea of plausibility structures really come up as, oh wow, could really do a lot of explanation as to what would help them return, or what kinds of factors go into them maintaining faith. They need to have a robust community of people who they have an affection for, like, older men, older women, people who they really respect highly and want to maintain the faith and the beliefs that those people have.
It also is helpful, too, in doing mission work or seeing what's happening in places like Europe, or even in Canada here, what's going on in Quebec, and why aren't there very many churches there, and why is it so hard to plant churches in Quebec? Well, when you take into account their plausibility structure, they're asking a lot different questions than we're asking.
Right.
So it's not whether or not I can believe in Jesus, it's whether or not there even is a God. Or, to go even farther, the question these days is whether or not there's just the physical, or there's anything more that exists beyond the physical universe. That really, in a secular culture, those are the base questions that are being dealt with. And so there's not all that prior knowledge.
And one other piece is that this also highlights the importance of doing things that will adorn the gospel as a community, right? Because your activity, your actions, the way you speak about one another, the way you treat people, especially those of the community or at large, thinks don't need to be treated well or should be treated well. How you engage in your actions do a lot of work in helping people see your community as either one that they would want to be a part of, or not. So it's not that the actions themselves have the saving capacity. They still have to hear the gospel and respond in faith. But the adornment, the activity around the proclamation of the word is going to help address some of those issues that we were talking about in terms of affection and all that kind of
tone
stuff.
In the way that you argue is part of this too. Is if you're dealing in the realm of affection, that people's plausibility structures are driven by their affections, and their affections are for people and their ideas. That if you're speaking in a way that is, hey, I'm just speaking the truth, but it's really demeaning, I'm just speaking the truth, there's a chance that you're actually just defeating the purpose of your communication by the tone of it. Even though you might be on the side of the truth, you're defeating it. And I think all of us fail at various points. I know I have. I'm sure all of us in the room have failed at various points when it comes to this. But it's in the modern world especially, it is really important that our tone is actually adorning the truth of what we're trying to say.
Good. Well, we're going to end it here because you've talked about Guinness and burgers, and
Wow. You're going to go to a pub?
let's go to Mission Springs for a burger.
And what else?
Is that your favorite
Coke.
burger,
No,
Darcy?
I'd
Mission
actually-
Springs? The Mission Springs burger.
I haven't been there for a long time, actually. I was just thinking of where would serve burgers and beer, and I thought of Mission Springs.
Interestingly enough,
'Cause
Oz
nowhere
is
else.
related to
The Guinness family.
Guinness
Really?
Yeah, he is.
Wow.
Is he a wizard too?
you get free beer
burn
for the
witches.
rest of your life if your last name's good.
Thank you for listening. Any questions, send them to extra@northview.org, and we hope this has been helpful.